thoughts?
Yeah, I think that the fact that I can't, it's a struggle for me to imagine what another country's like just fully fraudulent elections, how exactly that would look. I think that is the most interesting thing I'm taking out of this.
Awesome.
And I'm going to think about that. So.
All right.
That's right. Yeah. So you just ask me my name? No.
Yeah. Yeah, okay. How you doing today? What's your name?
Wait, that's 2 questions. I'm doing good. How are you?
I'm doing well.
Good. I go by Diamond.
You go by Diamond.
Yeah,
awesome,
yeah,
Diamond.
Yeah. What do you like
Is
to be
that
called?
spelled normally?
Yeah, Diamond.
Okay. All right, Diamond.
You go by Scott?
My name's Scott. Nice
Cool.
to meet you.
Good.
Or nice to talk to you.
Finally, yeah.
In person, right?
Yeah. In real life, SE.
In real life, SE. The plane's going overhead.
Yeah.
Nothing we can do about that. Wind going everywhere.
We'd have to go miles away to get away from the planes, but that's all right. Yeah.
Wind going everywhere.
But we're here.
But we're here.
And we're excited to talk to people.
And we're excited to talk to people, and the weather's holding out, and hopefully it holds out for a while so that we can be here.
Totally.
What do you want to talk about today, man?
I don't know. I don't have like a huge list of claims that I normally like am prepped for.
Yeah.
And so whenever I talk to people, if I'm making a claim, I tend to just think on the spot a little bit and sort of think out loud. We can talk about anything. I was just listening to a podcast on my way down here about voter fraud.
Voter fraud, yeah.
So we could talk about that. And it would be something along the lines of like, I don't think voter fraud is... I think the fear of voter fraud is a bigger problem than actual voter fraud in the U.S.
Okay. So, you think that the fear of voter fraud... would it be fair to say, I'm just going to put this in my own words, would it be fair to say that the fear of voter fraud has a greater effect on individuals than the actual voter fraud itself has an effect on individuals? Would that...
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure about why you put in the word individuals in there. Is that because for me, like,
it's just how
it affects everyone. Okay, yeah,
it's just how I'm interpreting it.
I'm good with that. I'm okay with that interpretation. Yeah, I mean, I think of it as like affecting the whole nation. Like, because it may not be just individuals. It may be that the policies enacted because of voter fraud maybe even affects the environment or something. Just the country in general, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Well, then that I guess leads me to my next question. Like, how many things do you think voter fraud could affect?
I think it could affect... So, the fear of voter fraud or actual voter fraud?
I mean, in this case, they're we're dealing with both at the same time, I guess. So, yeah, let's start with the fear, and if you have a separate list for the...
Okay, sure.
For the actual problem.
Yeah. So the fear of voter fraud, I'll start there. I think the fear of voter fraud causes laws to be passed making it harder to vote, for example. That's the most obvious direct consequence of it. And I think it also just leads to more and more suspicion. If you're already worried about it, you could become more paranoid if you take it as like a presupposition almost that it's happening, that there is voter fraud, that can lead you to become even more... You get the positive reinforcement bias sort of thing, and it can lead you further into believing that it's happening. I'm not sure if that's the right term for it, but I hope you get across my meaning.
Well, I generally repeat back how
Yeah,
I understand
okay.
something.
Sure.
So what I understood there was the fear of voter fraud can cause laws
Mm-hmm.
to come into effect that makes it harder to vote, as you said.
Yeah.
And then the suspicion and fear can generate a bias where you're always looking for voter fraud when there isn't. It's kind of like another bias that's very similar to this in my head, and you can tell me if I'm wrong here. It's the full moon, like everything bad happens on a full moon.
Yeah.
Or I'm trying to think of another one. That's a very common one. I can't think of another one. Would that be true?
Yeah. That's the idea I'm thinking. And so the effect is, just a being more concerned and having, I feel like, less happiness if you are worried about your neighbors cheating. You feel like you're living in a world of fraud, and that would be bad, I think. I think having less people voting is a bad thing as well. So that's kind of tied with that. I think those are the main two things. I'm trying to think if there's other consequences of the fear of voter fraud. It may lead to harassment too, if you're suspicious of people and then you're like constantly antagonizing them about it, if that makes sense. So I guess those three are probably the big ones I can think of now.
Okay. Now what I understood is that you already had three. And are you adding three more?
So one of those I think I had tied together with the first one. So the less people voting I had tied with the voter suppression laws, like the laws that people pass.
I missed that. Okay. I mean, that makes sense. The one would follow the other. Yeah,
exactly.
Okay, so that's still 5.
Wow. Okay, that's more than I was thinking. What else did you have there? What are my 5 then?
I have the fewer laws, or fear causes laws harder to make voting harder to write.
Yeah.
More suspicion, and I think you said
and so
paranoid.
The more suspicion, I was linking with unhappiness because of the more suspicion, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
those two are like, because just more suspicion isn't to me necessarily clear what the harm is, and so I think the unhappiness, the mental state, is the harm.
The mental state for
being in
the
fear,
suspicious is the harm.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
And an effect of that would be less happiness. That's what's
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
And then the harassment is linked to the positive reinforcement bias in the same way? Like it's an effect of the positive reinforcement bias or the...
No, I guess I had that one separate. The I mean, it could be linked, but the positive reinforcement bias, I think I guess that is a consequence, and it's just kind of, we could have that listed as a fourth separate one. Because it's causing poorer thinking, basically, which I think is a bad thing. So that they can all be tied together for sure, but we'll leave it like that.
Okay.
Those 4.
All right.
That's 4, right?
That's 4.
Okay, cool. I'm on the same page. Yeah.
Okay, so that's 4. Now, which one of these are individuals and which one of these are group ones? I imagine the laws one.
That's the group.
That's a group one,
yeah.
right? The suspicion and paranoia.
I mean, it could be either.
Yeah.
In the end, it's an individual's mindset.
Yeah.
But that could be lumped either way, because you can be suspicious of groups, or you can be, as a group, suspicious of other groups. Yeah.
And the positive reinforcement bias one is definitely individual.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, for sure.
And the harassment is individual.
That's another one that can go both ways, I think, because you can have entire, like, groups, like maybe an entire party harassing another party, so to speak.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So we got some reasons and effects here. Out of these reasons and effects, which one do you think is most important to you?
I think the laws are probably the most important.
Okay.
Because it's a very measurable impact, I think.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I'm a little bit struggling here. So what I have is, I think that the fear is greater than the problem.
Mm-hmm.
We've talked a lot about the fear. I don't know that we've talked about the actual problem yet.
No, right, not yet. Yeah.
And yeah, so let's talk about the problem.
Mm-hmm.
Let's talk about the problem portion.
Yeah. So I mean, the thing I would point to is just there's been like one actual case of voter fraud that's been like prosecuted.
Yeah.
As I understand it, in the U.S. History, I think. I could be wrong about that, but the only one I'm aware of is this one that I was just listening to on the Serial podcast, and it was like a very small rural town where there was, I think it was on the Republican side, they were going around and taking ballots for people and asking them if they'll fill out an absentee ballot, but then they would fill it out for them and even sign for them for some cases. Now I don't remember how many ballots they actually did that way, but it was fairly small number, I think, overall. I mean, in terms of the larger scheme of like even the county-wide, like I don't think it shifted the election. But that was like a real concrete example of voter fraud.
Yeah.
And so the effect it had was maybe, in a worst case scenario, I think, it maybe got like a sheriff elected that shouldn't have been elected. And perhaps in that county, maybe some other minor laws passed that shouldn't have in that one instance.
Okay.
And so I see that as affecting certainly the people in that region, the people who had their votes stolen, basically. It's absolutely impacting them. And on a wider scale, in that community, like if the sheriff shouldn't have been elected, well, then it's affecting all of the people that are now in that, in the result of that election. So that, but it's still impacting at a local level. Whereas the laws that are being passed, they may suppress millions of people, prevent millions of people from voting potentially. Okay. So that's where that dynamic, of one example of a local election having problems, that was actually confirmed and prosecuted, and then the more widespread laws that are affecting people.
Okay. So what I understood there was that there was one actual case that you knew from this NPR story where a sheriff was elected that shouldn't have been elected, and that affected that sheriff's purview, right, or the group that the
county
citizens,
will say,
the county, and you're comparing that to the national laws,
right,
that have been passed for voter
That's
suppression.
right. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Awesome. So what is your confidence at the moment?
In terms of the claim,
The original claim.
Yeah, that voter fraud's a larger problem. That the fear of voter fraud is a larger problem. I would be at solid 85%, something like that. I think pretty high.
All right. And what would be a couple, maybe one or two things that would increase your confidence?
To make me think it's even more of a problem, the fear is more of a problem, would be probably just the number of laws passed, or so if there's more impact, that would make me proportion it as a larger problem. I would also say if there's like more harassment, so any of those reasons increasing, I think that would shift me higher. Yeah.
And always generally the hard question is, what would decrease your confidence?
Right. Yeah, and I think that if there was like a large scale national fraud, like if the Stop the Steal thing were real, like if I honestly believed there was good evidence for that,
yeah,
I would probably reverse my position. That might flip me completely. If like some documents came out and be like, look, here it is, Biden maybe shouldn't have won or something like that, then that would definitely do it. Yeah.
Okay. Just trying to think. If we lived in a world where voter fraud was an actual problem,
Mm-hmm.
could you describe that in more detail?
Yeah. I think that you can see it in other countries, that it is a bigger issue. So, like if you look at the Russian elections, there's a lot of questions about the validity of their elections, and the legitimate newspapers over there would be reporting on stuff that as much as they can, and so there would be pretty clear evidence to show the problem with it.
Yeah.
And also, like, there are some other countries where the leaders don't even try, but they're like, they'll win by 100% of the vote, nearly, or 90% of the vote, and you're like, that doesn't seem like statistically likely. And there's also like mathematical techniques too. Oh, I think somebody just got engaged.
Nice.
Isn't that sweet?
It is nice.
Surprise! And we captured it on camera, sort of, off camera. Wow, I wonder if all of these people are, I think all of these people are related.
Probably.
That's cool.
Can you name like 5 attributes of the world? Because you're saying Russia,
right.
You're saying other countries. I mean, I don't know a lot about other countries, right?
Right. Okay. So, an attribute. So you're asking for an attribute of those situations that we would point to and be like, that's voter fraud problems. So
you mentioned one, which was
the mathematical
someone winning by 100%.
Yeah. The statistical variation from like the polls, for example, is a good indicator. So, clearly there's some statistical variation that, getting I talk about standard deviations, like if you had 2 standard deviations away, well, that can happen. That's not outrageous. If you get 5 standard deviations, that's a pretty clear indicator to me that it needs to be looked into more. It can still happen, but it's very, very rare, right?
A unicorn, as they call it?
Yeah, yeah, sure.
Yeah.
So that's like a symptom type thing, that may be a clue for it. But in terms of like other numbers that you could look to is, if there were, well, some of the things that have been suggested as happening that haven't panned out is like having more people in a county voting than were registered to vote, things like that. You could, the exit polls, I guess I already talked about. Well, there's small difference between exit polls and just normal phone call polling.
Yeah.
I would think exit polls would be hopefully a little closer. And then you can also have just like intimidation at a polling station, breaking the laws, going into like where people might canvass for votes within the polling area, that sort of thing. But these are still like kind of modest infringements, I would say, compared to what I think of as like when democracy is just totally not there anymore. Like if you were in North Korea or something like that. I mean, I guess they don't have elections there. Bad example. But yeah, I think that there's probably ones that I can't even think of right now because I just don't live that experience, I don't think.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So I did get like large percentage in voting.
Statistical anomalies.
Yeah, statistical anomalies. Exit polls. Intimidation, like at the polls.
Right.
So like, if there are armed guards, is that what you mean at the polls? Or?
Yeah, certainly.
Okay.
I mean, armed guards that are like politically affiliated, right? Yeah.
And then canvassing. Like I don't know if I understood the canvassing one.
Oh, just like encouraging people to vote a certain way for a party, but like in the U.S. we restrict it to you can't be within a certain distance of where people are voting, and so if people were coming inside of those, those zones, those like neutral zones, and still like with their buttons and being like, hey, come on, you gotta vote this way or whatever, that would be an issue too.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. And let's look at the opposite. Let's look at 5. Let's imagine a world where fear didn't exist.
Okay.
Right. And or voter fraud. Yeah. Let's look at a world where fear doesn't exist around voter fraud. What would that look like?
Right. So I would say it would look like you have a lot of faith in the electoral system. So you're just really confident. Like I think Canada might be a good example because they have like online voting, right? That they're clearly not that concerned, or at least they feel confident enough that their online votes are counted legitimately in order to be willing to do that. And so I think that might be a good indicator if people were comfortable with absentee ballots, comfortable with online voting, just checking a name off at the polling place instead of having an ID and having the address match and things like that. The name might be tricky because there could be people with the same name. So I think having a name and address would be good. But yeah, I think that those sorts of things that make things easier to vote would be good indicators of more confidence and less fear.
Okay. I think I'm done. I think we've covered this pretty thoroughly.
Yeah, I think so.
Did you enjoy the conversation?
Yeah, it was good.
Did I generate any interesting thoughts?
Yeah, I think that the fact that I can't, it's a struggle for me to imagine what another country's like just fully fraudulent elections, how exactly that would look. I think that is the most interesting thing I'm taking out of this.
Awesome.
And I'm going to think about that. So,
all right.
Cool. Thank you so much.
Thanks for the
Yeah.
interview.